Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear us. Yes? Okay. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I greatly apologize for the delay in us starting. It was out of our control, but we're happy to be here now. My name is Mina Oraibi. I'm the editor-in-chief of The National, the newspaper based here in Abu Dhabi, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session today on urban sustainability and the sharing economy. I think what you'll find is that we have a great panel here and a discussion that will be rich both in content and in ideas going forward. So without too much delay, I'll introduce our speakers. We have Valerie Levkov, who's Senior VP for Africa and the Middle East at EDF. Next, we have Michelle Davis, International Head of Clean Energy and Sustainability, Eversheds in Sutherland. Next, we have Martin Stuchtey, I got the name right, who is co-founder and magic director at Systemiq. He's also just authored a book entitled A Good Disruption, Redefining Growth in the 21st Century, and he'll be actually signing copies of his book outside right after we finish our panel, so be sure to go get one. And then we have Lara van Druten, who's magic director of Waste Transformers. So, you know, I think the context in what we're talking about here is really at the cutting edge of where we see the world going. We're talking about a sharing economy at a time where 5 years ago, if we had this conversation, I would probably have to give a dictionary definition of what does the sharing economy mean. But now all I need to say is Uber or Airbnb, bike sharing, and it's a concept that's really knowledgeable, especially in urban centers. So as we think about urban sustainability, and we're here at Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, and we think about how do we make sure that as more people today live in cities than in any other time before, that there are concepts like the sharing economy that will make sure that we have strong sustainability. Now, one of the most important sectors in that is the energy sector. So Valerie, I want to start with you, because we're seeing the sharing economy creating disruption in different industries, and I believe energy is one of those industries. But at the same time, could this be a way to have a more sustainable future as we think about different energy sources? And how does a major company like EDF deal with those changes?
Yes, thank you, Mina. It's sure that as of today, the energy sector is moving very fast, as what we have seen in the telecommunication sectors maybe 20 to 10 years ago. And we are at a turning point where even major utilities, as EDF, are going from centralized energy to decentralized energy, and from fossil fuel energy to solar and renewable energy. And that's where it comes for us to embed in our offers and systems more IT, more smart things, to answer to the consumer need or aspiration, which is to master its energy. Yeah. They want more and more personal devices, personal solar systems to be used at home. And with the decrease of solar panel cost, with the decrease of battery cost, we are now able to offer systems more linked to urban and personal consumption. But at the same time, with the sharing economy, we see more and more clients wanting to share their own devices. And to give an example, in France, we launched 2 years ago an offer for residential clients, which name was My Son and Myself. So it was a personal offer with solar and battery for domestic use. And this year, we launched Our Son and Us, which is sharing those devices among community, among housing system, between neighbors. And we see the same for a virtual power plant with electrical vehicle and batteries being able to share their power to the neighbors. So it is a disrupting point, and such companies like our prepare themselves by R&D, innovation, listening to the customers, and being more flexible and faster in developing new offers.
So decentralization is one point. It's enabling the consumer, but also allowing that decentralization. And so, Lara, I'm going to come across to your end, because that also requires partnerships. Requires partnerships between different industries, but it also requires partnerships on a social level and local level. So tell us about your experience of building those partnerships, but also that element of trust.
Perhaps if I can just take it one step back, I think that Valerie's already spoken to it, but there's probably three drivers for changes in the energy sector when it comes to the sharing economy. The first is, of course, the increased electrification, which is one of the items you've spoken about. The second one is probably about an increased digitization, so lots more connectivity, lots more optimization that's happening. And the third big one is about decentralization.
Right.
So how do you actually go about, for example, in the case of my company, no longer bringing the biomass streams or the waste streams to the power plant, but actually bringing the power plant to the waste,
Right.
as it were. Where you enable communities to actually become responsible for their own waste streams, to share the value in that waste stream, and to do it in such a way that they're able to power their own good growth, firstly, and secondly, that they're also able to re-win all of the nutrients inside that waste and use that to, for example, as a high-value compost in their own communities in order to grow their own food. That requires, on the one hand, that you actually kind of know each other.
Right.
Because you're sharing your waste. You're also sharing a financial model in which a number of people actually benefit. That speaks to the trust that you've been speaking about. But in order to make that happen, you actually have a whole ecosystem of different kind of partners necessary to realize that. So, for example, you need the EDFs of this world, because somewhere along the line you need to feed your energy as a local decentralized community back into the grid.
Right.
You need to have the waste companies who are prepared to look at a different model and a different value for their waste. You need smart and slow capital, because you have to finance that change. How do you go about financing that change? You need, for example, crowdfunding platforms. You need different kinds of mechanisms so that the community can pool their resources in order to power their own growth. And typically, you also need knowledge institutions, because the knowledge institutions are the ones who are out there looking at what's happening, making the analysis, and really bringing it down to a couple of points behind the comma, where they say this is really the added value that we're giving. So I guess you need a number of different stakeholders, but I think probably most of all, more than even the trust, is you need courage.
Right.
And that's courage to actually go out there, dare to do things differently, and to power that better future that we speak about.
Michelle.
Could I just pick up on a point that Lara just made and ask a question of Valerie? You said that you need an EDF to feed back into the grid, and I'm interested to hear if Valerie sees that grid as being a localized grid or a centralized grid.
So, of course, where the centralized grid is here, it's here for a long time. We have been investing for decades. Where the grid doesn't exist yet, like in Africa, this question is raised as of today. The difficult point is to see whether the economics are here for mini grids, isolated grids. So here also you have disruptive technologies that allows us to think that there will be more and more decentralized grids for insulated areas where the grid is not yet there and where it is most cost effective. So, and I do agree that grid is a backup and a sharing tool for electricity. The point is how cost effective it is, and you have to balance. And that is why in Africa, for example, there is more and more the off-grid electricity solution with solar panel. In EDF, it is an example of the disruption we are benefiting in. We are now selling solar kits and PVs without grid in order to give electricity to people who are far away from the grid sector. So there will be no grid, mini grid, and main grid, depending, and we have to adapt the solutions to the population and not the contrary. That is a main change. Yeah.
Martin, I want to turn to you because what we were talking about before was these are different elements, whether it's the partnerships, whether it's the disruptions, but that you need a systems-based approach because there is so much change happening at an accelerated pace. So I wanted to ask you about that. How do you build those systems or enable those systems that allow for urban sustainability and in large part the sharing economy taking off?
Look, on the one hand, the share economy is a really big thing, and it's going to get bigger simply due to the very simple economic fact that if you start moving, driven by technology, into a world where it's almost costless to operate an asset, the zero marginal cost world into which we are moving in the energy space, in the industrial space, or in the media space, we've had that all over, then of course the incentives to share are getting much bigger. So expect more of that. But it's part of a much bigger play because we don't want a shared economy. We want a decoupled economy. Everything that we've been discussing this week, or that we have seen yesterday, is around how can we allow economic growth in this century in a way that is not associated with the same environmental costs and with the same resource use as we have seen it in the last century. Now, and the good thing is that for the first time we start to understand that there's alternative model is available, and it doesn't come just as one technology. So I think we need to learn that we are not in a technology competition or in a corporate competition world. We're in a systems competition world where the new system and the old system are competing. We are able technologically to describe that new system, but it's very hard to say how we actually get there because there are so many lock-in effects that have been created, and it's very easy to imagine and to explain to ourselves that once you move into those new systems, that it's not just environmental concern, it's not just the attempt to be less resource dependent, and we are, but it's very much a way to overcome the massive structural waste that we've built into our system. Just look at the mobility system. I mean, our cars are parked 95% of the time. 1.2% of the time we are looking for parking space, or we are sitting in congestion. Out of all the energy that we put into a car, only 20% makes it to the wheels, and only a 13th of that is actually there to transport the person, because out of 5 seats, only 1.2 are on average used. And then the city space is 50% used for the car. Just imagine. I mean, it's the most precious thing we possess, our cities, and we are using it for the cars all over. The same thing goes for other systems. It goes for the food system, where 30% is lost, where only 5% of the nutrients that we put on the field ends up in the human body. Or the housing system, where even on a Tuesday morning, 60-65% of the space in a commercial building is actually not used, and after one use cycle of a building, it's useless. It's anything between hazardous trash and useless trash, and that's more than 50% of all the waste we generate. I mean, by all intents and purposes, there is so much structural waste built into the system that we need to move away from it. And sharing is one very important way, sort of, to intensify the resource utilization. But we also have to do other things. We have to regenerate. We have to make sure everything we are taking out, we are giving back, even through offsets or by reinvesting into the vitality of biosystems. We also have to optimize. We also have to loop, which you are doing with your fantastic business model. We also have to virtualize with the iPhone, where we put 20 functions into one, or where some transportation events sort of go away in the first place because you don't have to go anymore, unless you go to conferences, of course. And we have to substitute materials. All of that we have to do, and but sharing, as you can see in the automotive example, is such an important one because you have all the compounding effects of electrification, of autonomous, of cradle-to-cradle design, and then of sharing, which then creates a completely new high-performing system, which is in fact decoupled, and which sort of allows us to hope that this could be a better answer for this century to get people moved.
I mean, it was interesting because as you were speaking, you said we have to do we. Who encompasses in the we? I mean, Michelle, from your experience, how do you get those people who may be losing out from the system to feel that they are part of the we?
I think it'll probably be a combination in terms of who's driving it. Industry, government and consumer, and I think it will be a mix. And in the early stages, what we're seeing is government taking a reasonably active role in certain markets, controlling the amount of waste that is generated, having a concern about the amount of pollution now that is being generated by congested transport systems.
Right.
So we are seeing a greater push towards public transport, and we will without doubt see a greater push towards electric vehicles, which we are seeing in a number of markets, and with that the sharing of those electric vehicles. So I think industry, the government will initially embrace this. Industry will struggle because the more we share, the less we consume. So there is arguably a direct contradiction in terms of their interests. However, having said that, if we look in particular at the technology companies and their ability to drive demand and take control of the consumer approach, and I'm thinking of people like Google and Amazon, Microsoft, they are able to dictate what we want. If we look at the iPhone as an example, many years ago, people didn't want a phone that took pictures. They simply wanted a phone that was capable of making calls. These companies told us what we needed from our computer, what we needed from our iPhone. And I think once that they see the way this market is developing, they will utilize their various technological skills together with their skills at understanding how to drive consumer demand and change it to be a key participant in how this works.
So, but Valerie, your point earlier was about how industry in a way also has to respond to what consumers want, how their mindset is changing. And we're seeing that happen quite rapidly. At the same time, this issue of consumption, that people no longer want to feel that they're consuming just for themselves. So how did you make at EDF that change from offering something that said, my son, to suddenly our son? Was it a response from consumers, from your clients, or was it a sense of this is the only way we can progress forward?
Clearly, it was an answer to customers' aspiration, waiting solutions from us. And of course, there is a contradiction, as Michel said, between reducing consumption, which is good for sustainability, and so reducing our business, in fact, as a main utility. But in the same time, we are developing new solutions, new services, which are balanced that, and we are really proud to be a sustainable company which accompanies the movement and offers new solutions in order to be better aware of environmental issues. And what we can see is consumers are more and more aware of it, and they more and more ask for solutions to master their consumptions. And that's where digitalization comes. And we are also developing new services around digitalizations to help our consumers to better master their consumptions. So all in all, it's a win-win approach for governments, for consumers, and also for industry. So I am really convinced that there is a way for everybody to benefit from this movement, and the energy sector is really exciting as of today because of those major change which put energy at the center of a new era. So that's why sustainability in urban areas is really linked to energy sector.
I think it's an important point. I do believe that there are enormous opportunities and there's enormous scope, but at the same time, I think we shouldn't underestimate just how painful it is, the systems change. And what we're trying to do is something radically different. If I can give an example, and one of our installations is at a high-profile entertainment park in the Netherlands. And there we process on-site in our modular installations the waste of 12 restaurants, 2 theaters, and a hotel. So basically, these companies have come together to pool their waste and, in order to create value from it and to benefit from that value. It used to be the case that each of these companies had their own waste contract. So we would have anything between 8 and 10 huge waste trucks coming to the site every single day to pick up a bucket which was approximately this size. And of course, all of those trucks would run on diesel. They all had individual contracts. We said to them, if you can separate your waste at the source, we can provide a completely different model for that waste. And the fees that you're paying at the moment per ton to process your waste are about 190 euros per ton. We can do it at 60.
Right.
But all you have to do is process your waste at the source. And so there was a financial incentive in order for them to change their ways. The second thing we could do, we could drastically reduce their energy bill because we could produce green energy for them and give it back to exactly the same site. So there was the second incentive. The third incentive was with the high-level fertilizer that we create. And you would think with just the financial incentives alone, it would have been enough to say we're going to change our ways. It wasn't. Yeah, it really wasn't enough. We had a whole program in order to take people along in that process. We had the waste companies which were pulling their hair out saying, basically, we don't want to change. We want to do things as we've always done them.
Right.
We want to be the Uber of waste. Right? We want to transport it from left to right. We had to get them involved in the dialogue in order to do it. We had to get government involved in the dialogue because government was saying, well, how can you close a loop on site? This is something that's, that hasn't been done before. How is it even possible that you can make it happen? So by bringing in all these stakeholders, showing them that an alternative business model is technically, financially, and organizationally viable, you have to go through the pain. Yeah. It's the only way to get there.
Yeah, that's true.
And even though we see the opportunity, I think we shouldn't underestimate what that actually means and what it means for our hearts and souls.
Yeah.
But exactly as you said, I mean, there's the pain, the idea that you would get long-term gain for it. But part of the problem is also having long-term planning and seeing, having the strategy to say, okay, this may take this many years or this much time. So, Martin, I wanted to ask you from your experience about how do you get, whether it's an industry or a community, to say, okay, we're willing to take that long-term investment, knowing that in the end we will reap the rewards.
I think that's the scariest part of this whole story, the fact that we are going to deploy something like 72 trillion of investment into infrastructure and industrial capacity over the next 15 years. If we get that wrong, and that will be infrastructure and assets that are going to be around for the next 30 plus years. If we get that wrong, we are outside any reasonable corridor that, for example, would take us to a 2 degrees world. And so, if we have one chance now to build the proper infrastructure and get the right industrial capacity into place at a moment where, as you rightly say, we are quite afraid of that future vision that we are sort of very cautiously drawing here, because what we are talking here sort of is a massive play of creative destruction. So it's a huge Shakespearean play with winners and losers, and you've seen it in the energy space. I mean, there has been a very well-regarded German utility which sort of cut itself into two parts. The one didn't have a future, the other didn't have a business model, and it took a bit of time, and will take a bit of time to have a business model that's as lucrative as the one that they've given up. Try to tell the same story to the automotive industry, that just through services and just through providing mobility as a service and mobility platforms, they will be easily able to recover from the loss that they will be making in terms of volume throughput. And you could go on and on through all conventional industries. It's a major leap of faith to move from a product economy to a performance economy. I think once you are there, then simply by the power of the business cases, I mean, you haven't told us why we should do it despite the high cost. You told us it's just a much more economic model altogether, because you have all these different revenue streams that come out of your application. You have the savings in logistics, you have the aggregation advantages. So it's an economically better system, but with a lot of stumbling blocks on the way there. And that's why it's very important on the one hand sort of to make sure there is that you create an environment where there is enough attackers out there that actually take the pie in when the incumbents don't, which make it easier for the incumbents to think of themselves as radical incumbents that are in fact SDG compliant, 2 degrees compliant, and that have sort of a fair claim to live in the 21st century. Secondly, you need to make sure that for them it's easier, that you're creating a good level playing field, and that they have what miraculously started to work in the energy sector. I think in the energy sector, I mean, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, also when the entire climate process started, the development that we are seeing here and that we are celebrating here, that for the first time actually we have grid parity of renewables, and that defossilized future 2015 is not within reach, that I'm not saying, but it's thinkable for the first time. 5 or 10 years ago, it wouldn't even have been thinkable to go there. And the same thing now we have to go to do through all the different parts of all the sectors of our economy. We have to do it in the industry now. In the same way we have decarbonized or defossilized energy, we have to decouple the industrial sector, and we also have to offer companies in the same way they had a corridor to think by, or so at least some political instruments to think by. I'm coming from Germany, where it was very clear for the utilities all along that they would have to go to a new model. We owe the same long-term planning corridor to industry, so that they start finding out, moving into high-quality materials, closing the loop, offering business models that are all about utilization are in fact a good idea, and it's not the death of our shareholder value. It's in fact a way to be resilient and to demonstrably be able to grow under the new circumstances. And I think sort of whilst the energy sector is getting better, and sort of you will immediately tell me it's far from there, and you're right, but at least there is sort of a bit of line of sight where we're all going. If you make all the different decisions out there, they are convergent to the extent that we do know that we will go towards a defossilized economy. Does the same happen with regard to regenerative circular industrial sector? No, we are far away from that. We are currently getting signals which make us even more single use and more resource dependent.
Perhaps if I can just add one more thing quickly to that, and that is, I also find it very exciting in emerging economies. We've been speaking very much kind of from a Western perspective. If you look at the emerging economies, very often the infrastructure that we have in the West, the one that we have to refurbish, they don't have. Right. So they have this enormous opportunity to actually leapfrog. To leapfrog to different kinds of decentralized solutions. And there's another one, which I think, if we can pick up on that in terms of changing the system, that would be a great lever to actually be able to turn, to move us forward. Yeah.
I think one thing, though, to remember, and that's absolutely right, in emerging markets, we can leapfrog, but in the more mature markets, changing behaviour is a challenge. And if we use the renewable energy sector as an example, I think it's a good one in terms of why people do things. So why did people engage in renewable energy? Why were supermarkets, for example, 9 years ago, consuming renewables? It was because it made business sense for them to do so. They wanted to appear green because their consumers wanted them to be green. As soon as we hit the recession, probably beyond 8 years, but as soon as we hit the recession, the supermarkets stopped utilising renewable energy. Why? Because it was more expensive and the consumers were more concerned about the cost of bread and butter than they were about green energy. And we've seen that right throughout the evolution of renewable energy through to where it is mature now. For example, when the media was portraying the cost of renewable energy as being high around 3 or 4 years ago, governments, in particular in Europe, were very concerned politically about the impact that was having. It was impacting consumers to a significant degree. They started to remove the subsidies for renewables. Now, in the end, that was a good thing because we showed how quickly we could get to grid parity. But whilst some consumer behaviour can be changed by the focus on sustainability, for the large part, the change has to make sense for the consumer. Right. And so I think, for example, what EDF is doing and what Lara is doing is embracing that. It's saying, okay, ultimately we want to create something that is sustainable, but we're also creating something that makes sense for the consumer.
We've only got about 5 minutes before we have to wrap up, so I wanted to ask you each, what opportunity do you see, or what game changer do you see in the horizon at the moment that is going to change or accelerate urban sustainability, whether it's through the sharing economy or some other technology, mindset change, behavior, that you think, okay, this is the one thing I think we need to keep an eye on, and it's going to be an important game changer?
Well, if I have to choose one, which is very difficult, I may choose technology disruption by digitalization and innovation that will help us to go towards consumer aspirations and needs. And so we have to keep an eye on all the innovation coming from startups, from labs, everywhere, and apply them not only in our European market, but also, and maybe first, in the emerging market.
I would say the same. So whilst we focus on, for example, battery storage and other storage solutions, it's the technology that will enable those solutions to be integrated quickly and aggregated. So for me, it is around the whole technology piece. Yeah.
Is there a particular technology that you would think of?
Well, there's a whole host of technology that's out there at the moment. I won't name names, but there is a whole host of companies that are enabling that. Well, I know EDF is involved in residential storage solutions, for example, in the UK market. What will that do? In effect, it has the potential to create a mini power plant. So in simple terms, National Grid will say we need 200 megawatts now, and EDF will say, okay, we'll switch on Birmingham and utilise the 200 megawatts that is available from the residential battery storage in Birmingham. And that system will be able to respond much faster than any other CCGT plant.
Exactly.
It'll be on a different scale. So for me, I agree, it's around the whole technology piece.
I'm not wasting my hope on technology, because technology will deliver. So I'm absolutely exuberant about how technology will respond to challenges, and we have seen it in the energy sector and in many other sectors over the last 10, 20 years. So I'll save my hopes for a piece of regulation and one emotional element. The piece of regulation, I think, the one game changer in the second pillar. So if the first pillar is a defossilized energy sector, and then the second pillar is a decoupled industrial sector, the one piece that could change everything, if we were making take-back a general standard. It's a very easy rule to bring to life, where we would be forcing everyone who is bringing goods out onto the market to generally take them back. And of course, you would have to define exactly how that works. You would change the incentives immediately to design as much value into your products, as much longevity, as much customer intimacy, as much data richness or information richness into your, and you would had an incentive to design out all the toxicity and all the liabilities that we are currently pushing out to society. So one very simple rule which would completely change the way we think about industrial production. And as it is so simple, I'm quite hopeful. The second thing I'm very hopeful, I'm speaking a lot in front of students and children. Well, my students at university, or then the youngsters in my firm. Then I have 6 kids at home. They get it. They absolutely get it. They are much better systems thinker than we will be with all training.
That's great. Yeah, well, that's always hopeful. I mean, one of the things that Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week has been about, youth who will lead the charge and, as you said, get it, and will probably come up with ideas and system solutions that perhaps we're incapable of. Lara, I want to give you the last word on this.
I guess my concern would not be about energy. I realize we're in the Future Energy Summit, but I truly do believe that there's sufficient sources out there. My concern would much be about the natural resources that we have and the state of our natural resources. So think about our phosphates, our nitrates. and our products that we're basically consuming. And I think what we really need to do together is to figure out a way to be a lot more smarter in terms of how we use those natural resources and how we share those natural resources. So if I had to, if I were a betting person, which I'm not, but and if I had to place a bet, I think it would be on our collective intelligence to actually figure out a smarter and a better way to do this, simply because we have to.
And in large part, water. I mean, one of the issues here in this part of the region and concerns where everybody appreciates that water is probably going to be our biggest challenge, but still, perhaps whether it's the technologies, but also the partnerships that are required are yet to be properly built. Well, I want to thank you for a really engaging conversation. I appreciate that our panel have also other meetings to get to. So thank you very much for listening, and really warm applause for our panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.